10:41 p.m. The red-eye flight to New York was a sea of shadows. In row 22, Mark, a 40-year-old single dad, sat still while his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, slept beside him. The woman in the window seat looked exhausted. As the plane shuddered, her head drifted onto Mark's shoulder. He didn't wake her, but minutes later the aircraft lurched violently. The fastened seatbelt sign flashed. A flight attendant shouted, "Everyone stay seated!" In that heartbeat, the cabin plunged into a terrifying silence. They were dropping fast, and the stranger was still leaning on the only man staying calm. To understand Mark, you have to understand the weight he had carried for the last 6 years. At 40, Mark was a man carved from patience and quiet resilience. Since the day his wife, Sarah, passed away in a quiet hospital room, leaving him with a 3-year-old daughter in a world that suddenly felt too large, he had become the ultimate anchor. Grief hadn't broken him. It had tempered him like steel. He was a structural engineer by trade, a man who spent his days calculating the integrity of bridges and the wind resistance of skyscrapers. He lived in a world of tolerances, load-bearing capacities, and failure points. He understood how things held together under pressure. It wasn't just his job, it was his personality. When a storm hit, most people looked at the swaying trees. Mark looked at the foundation. He knew that stability wasn't the absence of movement, but the ability to absorb it without snapping. Mark wasn't a man who sought the spotlight. He was the guy who sat in the back of the room, observing the small details. The way a bolt was tightened, the way a person's tone shifted when they were lying, or the way the clouds gathered on the horizon. Tonight, he was flying for a major project in Manhattan, a rare moment where his demanding work life and his life as a father collided. He had spent the week preparing blueprints for a suspension bridge, a structure designed to dance with the wind rather than fight it. He didn't realize that tonight he would have to become that bridge himself. Beside him, Lily was his entire universe. She was a bright, imaginative child, but she had inherited one specific fear from the night her mother died: the fear of things falling. To Lily, a plane wasn't a marvel of engineering. It was a fragile bird in a vast, unpredictable storm. Before they had even boarded the flight at LAX, she had looked at the darkening sky with trembling lips, her small hand clutching her weathered stuffed rabbit. "Barnaby. Dad, what if the wind is too strong? What if the sky doesn't want us there?" she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the airport's intercom. Mark had knelt down on the cold terminal floor, bringing himself to her eye level. He looked her directly in the eyes with a calm that acted like a physical shield. "Lily, look at those wings," he said, pointing out the window at the Boeing 787. "They aren't stiff boards. They are built to flex, like a bird's wings, or like the trees in our backyard. They are built to handle things much worse than a little wind. We are safe because the engineers planned for the unexpected. They built the what-ifs into the metal." Lily believed him. She believed him because Mark never lied to her about the world. He just showed her the math behind the survival. He was her constant in a world of variables. The woman in the window seat, Seat 22A, had boarded late, just as the cabin doors were closing. She looked to be about 34, dressed in a simple but elegant charcoal sweater. Her movements were heavy, as if she were carrying an invisible burden of 1,000 sleepless hours. She didn't have a carry-on, just a small briefcase she clutched like a lifeline. She hadn't looked at the menu. She hadn't reached for the headphones. She simply buckled her seatbelt, leaned her head against the cold plastic of the window, and closed her eyes before the plane even left the tarmac. Mark noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the mark of someone who had been running on fumes, perhaps fighting a battle of her own. The cabin settled into the late-night rhythm. The clinking of the beverage cart faded into the distance. The lights dimmed to a deep oceanic purple, designed to trick the body into sleeping. Mark held his book in one hand, but his mind was elsewhere. He was monitoring the hum of the engines, the slight change in pitch as they leveled off at 38,000 feet. He was the silent guardian of row 22, a man who lived in the spaces between the noise, making sure the world stayed upright for those who depended on him. He thought of Sarah and how she used to say his calm was contagious. He hoped she was right. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin was a graveyard of sleepers. The engine noise had become a hypnotic white noise, a steady vibration that lulled the conscious mind into a deep, rhythmic trance. The cabin air felt stale and recycled, but the quiet was absolute. It happened slowly. The woman in 22A, deep in the throes of REM sleep, began to lose the battle with gravity. In her exhaustion, her body sought a center. Her head slipped from the window, nodding forward, then tilting toward the center of the row. Mark felt a soft pressure on his right shoulder. It was light at first, a mere suggestion of weight. Then it became certain. She didn't stir. She didn't wake. She simply found a stable place to rest in a world that was constantly moving. Mark froze for a split second. His first instinct as an engineer was to correct the imbalance. In a different world, he might have cleared his throat or shifted his weight to wake her politely. But he looked at her face in the dim cabin light, the way her jaw had finally relaxed, the way the lines of stress around her eyes had smoothed into something peaceful. He knew that kind of exhaustion. He had felt it in the early years of single fatherhood. Those nights when he would fall asleep sitting up in a rocking chair, his body finally surrendering to the relentless demands of a life alone. Gently, using his free hand with the precision of a surgeon, he reached down and adjusted the thin airline blanket that had slipped from her lap, tucking it just enough to keep her warm without disturbing her. He became a human pillar, holding his shoulders steady, absorbing the micro vibrations of the plane so she wouldn't slip. For that hour, he wasn't just a passenger, he was a support beam. Then the air changed. As a structural expert, Mark knew the signs. It started as a subtle tremor, like a car driving over a gravel road at high speed. He felt it in the floorboards first, a high-frequency vibration that hummed through the soles of his shoes. Then, the wings didn't just flex, they bucked. The aircraft hit a pocket of clear air turbulence, a ghost in the sky that radar often misses. The plane dropped 50 feet in less than a second. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed twice, a frantic, urgent sound that cut through the silence like a blade. A few rows back, a man gasped. A woman's sharp scream ignited a chain reaction of fear. The cabin lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the ceiling that looked like grasping fingers. Lily woke up instantly. The transition from deep sleep to pure terror was instantaneous. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering emergency lights. She reached out and grabbed Mark's hand, her fingernails digging into his palm with a strength born of panic. "Dad! Dad, what's happening? Are we falling down?" Mark didn't flinch. He didn't let the fear in the cabin infect his voice, even as the plane lurched again, tilting the floor at a sickening angle. He leaned toward his daughter, keeping his right shoulder perfectly still for the sleeping woman, who, incredibly, was still pinned to him by the force of the drop. "It's just rough air, Lily," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor that refused to drift. "Remember what I told you? It's like a boat on the waves. The ocean isn't always smooth, and neither is the air. We're just passing through a little ripple in the sky. It feels big, but the plane is stronger. Keep your belt tight, honey. We're okay." The turbulence intensified. The plane began to shake with a violent metallic shudder that made the plastic panels of the cabin groan. Overhead bins creaked as luggage shifted like stones in a river. The flight attendants, who had been preparing the morning service in the galley, scrambled to their jump seats, their faces tight with professional concern that they couldn't quite hide. Lily was shaking now, her small body vibrating with the plane. "It feels like the floor's gone. I want to go home, Dad." "We're going to New York, Lily, and we're flying," Mark corrected her gently, his tone firm but kind. He squeezed her hand, a grounding pressure that said, "I am here, and I am not moving." In the midst of this chaos, the woman on his shoulder remained asleep. It was a strange, surreal bubble of peace in the center of a storm. Her exhaustion was so deep that even the violent jolts had only integrated into her dreams. Mark realized that if she woke up now, in the middle of a violent lurch, the disorientation would be catastrophic. She would wake up to a screaming cabin and a stranger's shoulder. He chose to stay still. He braced his feet against the floor and used his core strength to stabilize his upper body, acting as a shock absorber for her. He was protecting her rest while guarding his daughter's courage. He was a man holding two lives steady with nothing but his own will. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Mark's life. The turbulence wasn't letting up. It was evolving into a rhythmic, violent thrashing. The aircraft felt like it was being gripped by a giant hand and shaken in frustration. A suitcase in the overhead bin 3 rows up shifted with a loud, ominous thud, and a latch clicked open. "Stay seated! Everyone stay seated! Keep your belts fastened!" The lead flight attendant yelled over the intercom, her voice competing with the roar of the wind shearing against the hull. Mark could feel the tension in the cabin reaching a breaking point. People were waking up in a state of pure, raw panic. He saw a man across the aisle clutching his armrests so hard his knuckles were white as bone. He heard a child crying somewhere in the front, a thin, wailing sound that made the hair on Mark's neck stand up. He thought of Sarah, how she would have held Lily, how she would have looked to him for reassurance. He couldn't let her down. Mark turned his full attention to Lily. He knew that children didn't look at the situation. They looked at their parents. If he looked scared, she would be traumatized. If he stayed calm, she would find a way to breathe. He had to be the bridge that didn't collapse. "Look at me, Lily. Eyes on me," he commanded softly. She turned her tear-streaked face toward him, her breathing ragged. "Count with me," Mark said, his voice rhythmic and slow. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. "The plane is strong, Lily. The pilots are the best in the world. They do this every day. We are just moving through the sky." At that moment, a massive jolt hit the plane, a negative G event. It was a lateral shift, a sudden sideways kick followed by a drop that sent a loose water bottle flying across the cabin. The force was so great that the woman on his shoulder finally jolted awake. She sat up abruptly, her eyes snapping open, her breath catching in a ragged, terrifying gasp. She looked around, disoriented by the flashing lights and the screaming passengers. Her heart was hammering so hard Mark could almost feel it through the fabric of their clothes. "What's happening?" "Oh God, are we crashing?" she whispered, her voice high and thin, her hands clawing at the air. Mark didn't look away from Lily, but he moved his head just enough to catch the stranger's gaze. His expression was as steady as a mountain. "It's just turbulence," he said, projecting a confidence he had to manually manufacture. "Heavy weather, but the plane is handling it perfectly. Look at the flight attendants. They are seated and safe. Just breathe. You're okay, I promise." She looked at him, then looked down and realized she had been leaning on him for hours. Her face went pale, then flushed a deep, embarrassed red. But before she could apologize or move away, another jolt hit, sharper than the last, and she instinctively reached out, grabbing Mark's forearm with both hands. He didn't pull away. He didn't even flinch. He let her hold on. "I've got you," Mark said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the rattling plastic. He included both the stranger and his daughter in his protective aura. "The rough air will pass. It's a temporary state. Just hold on to me." The woman's grip tightened, her nails pressing into his sleeve. She was shaking, a primal, visceral reaction to the loss of control. Mark realized that for her, this wasn't just about a bumpy flight. It was the manifestation of every fear she had been running from. Every late night at the office, every missed meal, and every lonely hour culminated in this moment of airborne chaos. Yet as she looked at Mark, something in his unwavering focus began to tether her back to reality. He wasn't just surviving the storm, he was standing in it, unmoved. For the next 5 minutes, Mark was the center of Row 22's universe. He held his daughter's hand with his left and let the stranger grip his arm with her right. He was the human tether between panic and peace. He watched the wings through the window. They were vibrating, yes, but they were holding. He knew the math of the rivets. He knew the tensile strength of the aluminum. And more importantly, he knew the endurance of the human heart. Slowly, the violent shaking began to subside. The jagged drops turned into rhythmic bumps, then into a gentle swaying motion, like a cradle. The roar of the wind outside faded into the familiar, comforting hum of the engines. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, sounding weary but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've finally cleared that weather system. We apologize for that rough ride. It was unexpected, but we're through the worst of it. We'll be at our destination in about 90 minutes. Everything is under control. Flight attendants, you may resume your duties." A collective audible sigh swept through the cabin. People started to murmur, a low tide of relief. The tension snapped like a dry twig. The stranger, Claire, let go of Mark's arm, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. She saw the gray at his temples, the kindness in his eyes, and the absolute unshakable calm that had just saved her from a complete spiral into terror. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of sleep, but the profound silence of shared survival. The cabin was awake now, but the frantic energy had been replaced by a quiet, reflective sobriety. Claire took a deep, shaky breath, her hands still resting near Mark's arm as if afraid the ground might disappear again. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of embarrassment and profound gratitude. "I am so incredibly sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking as she tried to smooth her hair. "I didn't mean to. I must have been out cold for hours. And then to wake up like that. I'm so sorry for grabbing you. I must have been a burden." Mark offered a small, tired smile. It was the smile of a man who understood the fragility of being human, a man who had seen enough broken things to know that being a burden is sometimes the only way to stay upright. "Don't apologize, Claire. You weren't a burden. You looked like you needed the sleep more than I needed the shoulder. It's been a long night for everyone on this plane." Claire leaned back, her heart finally slowing down to a normal rhythm. "I've been traveling for 30 hours, 3 connecting flights from Europe. I have a presentation in 4 hours that determines the future of my startup. Everything I've worked for. I think my brain just reached its limit and shut off." Lily, who had finally stopped shaking, looked over at Claire. Her fear had been replaced by curiosity. "My dad stayed very calm," she said, her voice filled with a child's pure pride. "He told me the wings are built to flex. He wasn't even scared." Claire smiled at the little girl, a genuine, warm expression. "Your dad is a very smart man, Lily, and a very brave one. His calm helped me too. I was terrified, and looking at him made me feel like the sky wasn't so big after all." Mark looked out the window at the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon, a thin glowing ribbon of gold and violet cutting through the indigo sky. It was the most beautiful thing he had seen in years. He thought of how Sarah would have loved this view. She always said that the dawn was a reminder that even the darkest nights have a deadline. "Were you really not scared, Dad?" Lily asked suddenly. She looked at him with wide eyes, seeking the truth. To her, he had always been invincible. Mark was silent for a long moment. He could have said no. He could have maintained the illusion of being a superhero, the father who fears nothing. But he looked at Claire, who was watching him intently, and he looked at his daughter, and he decided to tell the truth. Sarah would have wanted him to be honest. "Of course I was scared, Lily," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. Lily's eyes widened. "Then why didn't you show it? Why were you so still while everyone else was shouting?" Mark reached out and tucked a stray hair behind Lily's ear, his hand finally showing a tiny, human tremor. "Because when you're a dad, or when you're a leader, or just a person sitting next to someone who is hurting, you realize that someone else needs your calm more than you need your fear. Fear is a natural reaction, Lily, but it doesn't solve anything. Calm is a choice. I chose to stay still so you and Claire could have something to hold on to." He looked at Claire as he spoke, acknowledging the silent pact they had formed in the dark. It was the choice of a man who had learned that true strength wasn't about the absence of fear, but the mastery of it for the sake of those who couldn't yet master their own. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent her life in the cutthroat world of international business, where showing vulnerability was a sin, and calm was often just a mask for aggression. But this man, this stranger in row 22, was different. His calm wasn't a mask, it was a sacrifice. It was a gift he gave to a daughter and a stranger. They talked for the rest of the flight as the sun climbed higher. They didn't talk about spreadsheets or engineering blueprints. They talked about the things that mattered. Claire talked about the fear of failing her employees. Mark talked about the challenges of teaching Lily how to navigate a world without her mother. They were two strangers who had shared a moment of extreme vulnerability, and in that space, a genuine human connection had formed, a bridge built in the middle of a storm. As the plane began its final descent into JFK, the city lights below looked like a carpet of diamonds scattered on black velvet. The fear of the turbulence was a memory now, replaced by a quiet, reflective peace that felt as solid as the ground they were about to touch. The wheels touched the tarmac with a smooth, confident churr that signaled the end of the ordeal. The cabin lights came up to full brightness, harsh and unforgiving. The magic of the night flight was over, replaced by the mundane rustle of jackets and the clicking of seatbelts being undone. As they stood up to gather their bags, the atmosphere in the cabin was transformed. The passengers moved with a sense of camaraderie. People who hadn't spoken for 6 hours were now smiling at one another. They had survived the storm together, and that shared experience had stripped away the walls of anonymity. Claire pulled her carry-on from the bin, her movements more certain now. She turned to Mark, her hand extended. "I don't even know your name," she said, her eyes searching his. "Mark," he replied, shaking her hand. His grip was exactly as she expected, firm, steady, and warm. "Well, Mark, thank you for earlier, not just for the shoulder, but for being the person you are. You have no idea how much I needed that tonight. You saved more than just my sleep." Mark nodded, a simple gesture of humble acknowledgement. "Safe travels, Claire. Good luck with your presentation. You've got the strength to get through it. I saw it in the way you held on during the turbulence." "Thanks to you, I might actually stay awake for it," she joked, though her eyes remained serious. She took a step toward the aisle, then paused. "I hope our paths cross again, Mark. The world needs more people who know how to stay still." She walked down the aisle, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. Mark watched her for a second, then turned to Lily, who was busy struggling with her backpack. They walked through the jet bridge and into the bustling, noisy terminal of JFK. The morning air was crisp and smelled of jet fuel, floor wax, and expensive coffee. It felt wonderful to be on solid ground. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, washing away the stagnant pressure of the cabin. "Dad?" Lily asked as they walked toward baggage claim, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. "Yeah, honey?" "You were like the pilot back there," she said, skipping a little to keep up with his long, purposeful strides. "Even when the plane was shaking and the lights were blinking, you were the one driving the calm. You were the strongest thing on the plane." Mark laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed in the high ceilings of the airport. He reached down, picked her up, and swung her around in a circle, holding her close to his chest. "No, Lily," he said, kissing the top of her head as he set her down. "I'm not a pilot. I'm just your dad. And that's the most important job I'll ever have. Everything else is just details." As they walked out into the bright New York morning, Mark felt the weight of the last 6 years feel a little lighter. He was a man who built bridges, but today he realized that the most important bridge he had ever built wasn't made of steel, concrete, or cable. It was the bridge of trust he had built with his daughter, and the bridge of kindness he had extended to a stranger. It was a bridge built with nothing more than a steady shoulder and a heart that knew how to stay calm when the world started to shake. The turbulence had hit, the sky had screamed, but row 22 had never been more stable. Because in the middle of the storm, there was a father who knew that the only way to survive the fall is to be the one who stands still. She slept on his shoulder, the storm hit, but she didn't fall, because he was there. If this story touched your heart, follow High TL Stories for more tales of quiet heroes and the power of human connection. Let's find the calm together.